Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Chatham House. It is my very great pleasure to have an extraordinarily distinguished group of people with us this evening to speak to you. Let me just tell you what the format of our evening is. My name is Michael Keating. I'm the director of a project at Chatham House whose objective is to encourage informed decisions about the political future of Afghanistan. This event is being held on the record. It is being live streamed, so please have no illusions about Chatham House rules or anything like that for this. And comments can be made on via Twitter on hashtag #CHEvents, and questions can be asked on hashtag AskCH or by emailing questions@chathamhouse.org. There will be a drink after this for those of you who can stay just upstairs, so I hope as many of you will stay as you can. And our fourth speaker has arrived. Not at all. You need to be mic'd up somewhere. So.
I do apologise for the precedence of the tube strike.
So if you could kindly all put your phones on silent mode, I'd be grateful, or switch them off. And let me just introduce our four speakers in the order in which they will be speaking. First of all, Saad Mohseni. Saad, we're delighted that you could come today. Saad is the chairman of the Mobi Group and has probably been more influential than any other individual in mobilizing perhaps the media, the Afghan media in Afghanistan over the last months and years, particularly around the elections. You are an Australian national and went back to Afghanistan in 2004 and with your brothers created the country's leading privately owned and integrated media company. I hope that is accurate. Launched Arman Radio in 2003, and the group's interests include Tolo TV, Tolo News, Lemar, and Farsi One. And you have won a number of international awards for the work you've done, including from Reporters Sans Frontières. Tolo TV won that. Secondly, I'll turn to Alyssa Rubin, who was the New York Times bureau chief in Afghanistan for many years until last year. You're now in Paris. You're continuing to cover Afghanistan intermittently from Paris and will be going back there. And I know from my personal experience of seeing you at work that you are an extraordinarily diligent reporter. Leave no stone unturned. So thank you very much for coming from Paris. Anatole, I think is fairly familiar to Chatham House, is the chair of international relations at the War Studies Department of King's College London, and it isn't in the bio notes I've been given, but you were a correspondent for the Times in Afghanistan back in the 80s.
Well,
based in Pakistan. And you have just been hosting a meeting on Pakistan today, so we may ask you to compare Afghanistan and Pakistan when we get around to that, particularly on the election side. And Thomas Rutig has been on the Afghan scene since the early 1970s, or mid-1970s? 1980s, forgive me. You're not that old. But I know you went as a student, right? Yeah, and Thomas founded the Afghanistan Analyst Network, has been a visiting fellow at various think tanks, including SWP in Germany. He's also worked for the UN and for the EU, and is one of the most prolific and well-informed analysts and commentators on Afghanistan. So we're absolutely delighted, Thomas, that you could join us today. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask each of the speakers to talk for about 7 minutes. I will wave a piece of paper in front of you when you get to minute 6. And then I'm going to ask the audience, please, to ask questions by stating who you are and being very clear about your question, and hope that we can have a lively question and answer session. I'm not going to speak very much. I suspect most of you in this room know what's going on in Afghanistan. we had the first round of the presidential and provincial elections on the 5th of April, and the latest results announced are that there are two leading candidates by far. That's Abdullah with 44.9% of the vote, Ashraf Ghani with 31.5%, Zalmay Rasool, who was said to be the candidate favored by the president, at 11.7%, and Sayyaf at 7.1%. So the issues now are whether there will be a second round and what exactly the timing of that will be. This is utterly unprecedented in Afghanistan's history to have a second round, and it will stretch the capacity of the security and electoral authorities to do that. Whether, if there isn't a second round, whether there'll be some kind of political deal, and what the role of the incumbent president will be in the weeks, possibly months, of uncertainty that lie ahead, if indeed they do lie ahead, because many people cannot believe that the incumbent president will be, walking off the stage anytime soon. Most people feel that the elections have gone much better than expected, whether from a security perspective or otherwise. Clearly, there has been irregularity, there has been fraud, and so on. And it is not so much the incidence of these problems that matters, but the political reaction to them. And there, again, I hope I'm not being too controversial with my fellow speakers. Most people feel that the candidates and indeed the incumbent president have behaved in a manner that has been more positive than most had anticipated. But clearly, much can still go wrong. And an awful lot depends upon these elections resulting in an individual who is considered by the Afghans and by the international community to be legitimate. Last thing I will say is that the role of the Afghan media in these elections, I think, has been very different to the role that it has played. This is something I will ask you, Saad, in previous elections, partly because the media itself has evolved, but there has been a lot of vigor in the Afghan media's approach to the elections. So, Saad, the question I would like to ask you is what you think the significance of these elections is, obviously recognizing they're not through it, and what about the role of the Afghan media in these elections?
Thank you, Michael. Well, I think that, I talk very often about the three transitions: political, military, and economic. Now, the first challenge for us was with the elections, because we felt without a legitimate government after June or May, whenever the new president was meant to get inaugurated, then we would have no hope with the other two transitions. And early on, we realized that in 2009, we all made mistakes. I think that the president made quite a few mistakes. We, as a media outlet, or the media sector, made a lot of mistakes. We failed to engage the population. When results of the fraud first emerged, we were very quick to declare the entire process as illegitimate. And we had learned quite a few mistakes, because what we did was we essentially damaged the entire process for the next 5 years. Although there was a lot of fraud, out of 4.5 million, 1.5 million votes were fraudulent. Nonetheless, I think that the lesson learned by us was that we should take great care. We should ensure that the population was engaged, that they would participate, that the candidates were forced to talk policy rather than personality or ethnicity. So going back to even 12 months ago, what we felt was we had to ensure that the president was going to stick to his commitment to hold elections on April the 5th. So one thing which I recall going back to, I think it was almost 18 months ago, was that at every press conference, our presidential correspondent, she had only one question to ask the president: will the elections take place on time? Will you be running? So eventually he said yes so often it became a case of self-fulfilling prophecy. A lot of his cabinet ministers, a lot of people who were adamant that he would run again, that he would find a way to hold on to power, even they were convinced after so many declarations by the president. So that was the first thing that we did. And of course, the other media outlets, it's just not us in Afghanistan. Just in Kabul, we have 70 other television stations. And the other thing which we felt was important was that we needed to engage this very apathetic population of ours, post-2009, where people saw for themselves as to how fraudulent the entire process was. How do we re-engage the Afghan public? So we actively talked about the elections 3 months ago. We had 4 to 5 hours of programming daily to engage the public. And to be quite honest with you, I mean, I think even like a month before the elections, we were not sure if we had succeeded. So a number of things happened. I think first and foremost, I think we have to give a lot of credit to the candidates. They came out, they campaigned very courageously. I mean, they went to all, to every possible, of all the major cities and villages and towns, as many as they could possibly visit, they visited. They campaigned without much security. They gave speeches. So I think that engaged the public. The second thing, of course, was, I mean, these elections also became a referendum on the Taliban. The Taliban were adamant that people should not come out and vote, that the entire process was a foreign process, it wasn't Afghan, for people not to participate. And the suicide bombings prior to the elections, in a bizarre way, mobilized the Afghan public. And I think that in a way we could argue that people had an epiphany of sorts. And we noticed that like a couple of weeks before the elections that people were lining up to register because a lot of Afghans did not have registration cards. And at 5:30, they would line up at 5:30 and they would end up getting their cards at 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And of course, what media does best is to amplify this renewed enthusiasm in the process. And again, that helped, I think, a lot of other people come out. And of course, on election day, I mean, we lost 2 or 3 good friends before the elections. We made a commitment that we would talk about Taliban attacks, but we would not overdo it. And I think it was a commitment that the journalists made. Obviously, we were not involved in that decision, but one we respected. And I think that helped a lot as well, because I think that the minor incidents, made the news, but they were not like the top of it.
So there was a deliberate decision not to overplay or to play up the incident.
They realized the impact it would have on the elections. They felt that, some of these incidents would not warrant, the first 15 minutes of the major news bulletin. So that decision, I believe, helped. Some people would not agree with me.
There was even a boycott, wasn't there? A decision by some.
It's funny that the person who was leading the boycott was the first person who broke the boycott by tweeting about a certain incident. Right. So it's very difficult for news people to keep that sort of thing quiet. But nonetheless, I think that they did stick to their guns in terms of not, overdoing it as far as news coverage is concerned. And of course, on election day itself, I think a lot of people were watching in the first 2 or 3 hours, and the coverage was good enough. I mean, people realized that there were huge queues everywhere, and people were totally engaged and committed to vote. And I think that encouraged a lot more people to come out and vote. And that's why I think a lot of people ran out of ballot papers in the afternoon. So I think, yes, it's a success. I think a lot of people should take credit for this. I think it's the Afghan public, the courage that they showed, quite extraordinary, to be honest with you. I think the politicians played a very positive role by campaigning so well and so effectively. The security forces did a relatively good job, and as Thomas said a few minutes ago, that there were more incidents in 2014 than 2009, but there were a lot more people out there voting. In 2009, I mean, the voter turnout was very low. And I think that the IEC in particular has done a relatively good job so far, and the politicians themselves have been fairly responsible. But we have a long way to go, and we have some big challenges ahead.
I mean, do you think, would you go as far as to say that the Afghan media made a difference in that people were voting for what the candidates stood for? I mean, in terms of some of the things they were saying about what they would do, or is that a stretch?
We had a series of debates, for example. So in each, we had a debate on security policies, another one on economic policies, another one on foreign policy. So all the candidates were forced to come up with these policies. I mean, I recall in 2009, they were just, it was off-the-cuff remarks. But this time, every candidate had his policy paper on each sector.
Right.
So I think that the media forced them to actually elaborate as to what they would do in relation to each area.
But do you think that made a difference in terms of the way people voted?
Well, I mean, I can give you anecdotal evidence of people who are not particularly well educated saying that, I would like to see this person improve jobs prospects for my kids or schooling or the health sector. So I think people do care. And I think, listen, Afghans, we have been exposed to various ideologies and a lot of charismatic people. I think that we've had enough of both probably. We want results now. And, we're not cynical. I think that people are still enthusiastic. But I think people are not going to be deceived that easily when it comes to politicians.
Right. Fantastic. Alyssa, so you have covered Afghanistan for many years. What do you think? Well, first of all, I'd be interested in knowing what you think of the role of the Afghan media, but in particular, the influence of the international media, both on the Afghan media, but in terms of shaping the story about Afghanistan.
Well, I think obviously there's sort of the international media has two faces, and one of them is sort of the face or the way it writes about the story for its own audience, whether that's British journalists writing for people in the Commonwealth or the Americans writing for American journalists writing for Americans. And that, I think, has a very direct impact on how the story is perceived. And I would say, to my mind, there was a lot of good journalism, but there were sort of two big categories that dominated. And one was sort of stories that fit into the anti-terrorism narrative, which was, stories about the Taliban, about Al-Qaeda, about the readiness of the Afghan military to fight that battle, and then a more of an anti-war narrative. And you saw a lot of articles that were about civilian casualties of U.S. and British soldiers, particularly, although others as well, and stories about things that went wrong. Now, obviously, those can also be true, but they're also part of how the Afghan story has been perceived, I think, in those abroad and by the countries that are active on the ground. Now, for the Afghan media, I don't think it would be hubris to suggest that the international media has any direct effect on most Afghans. It's Saad at Tolo and some of the other big channels, and to some extent the BBC's Pashto and Dari service that have an impact on Afghans. What we can do, and I think have done, and I hope it's been helpful, is to write stories on areas that have been too sensitive for the Afghan media to fully explore. Sometimes they've raised them, but they're very hard because they're politically sensitive. And once they come into the public debate, they can become very important to Afghans and ultimately, to some extent, owned by all Afghans. And I was going to give a few examples of those because I think they really have made a difference in how we think about the story. One of them, obviously, was Kabul Bank, which was really began to change people's willingness to question President Karzai and some of the people around him, and also recognize that it wasn't just Pashtuns or just Tajiks who were benefiting, but both, and that it was a small elite, and that some of their suspicions might have been true. And that was a story that really was fleshed out by the international media, but then reported extensively as well by the Afghan media. And while they didn't have all of the tools that the Western media had to go to, bankers or to travel to Dubai and look up real estate records or all the different elements that were involved in reporting that scandal, they were able to publicize it. And that really changed, I think, the sense of what the elite was doing and what the political class was doing in Afghanistan. Another one that I thought was quite significant was one on the CIA paying President Karzai and giving him cash, because that story kind of flew in the face of actually what Westerners were always sort of going on and on about, the importance of, stopping corruption, and then there they are doing it. And I think that was a very important moment where, everybody had to own up that they were all doing it, and that the problem was really quite a shared one. And so that was something that I think the Afghan media then also extensively reported. Another, third one that I personally thought was very important was that the Western media did report quite a bit about war crimes, a very serious and lengthy war crimes transitional justice report that has to this day never been published. And it really laid out all the different wrongs that had been done. And since it's not been published, we don't know what it says, but the Western media at least spoke about its suppression. And it was also, bits and pieces of that were raised, in fact, by Afghan media, but sort of brought together. And then that was something else that I think has helped people be a little more willing to challenge power brokers and even feel emboldened to challenge the Taliban, who were, of course, among those who committed war crimes, but far from the only ones, since many current politicians are also among them. So I think that those are some of the ways that the West sort of indirectly has had an impact on Afghan media.
Can you think of any examples of the Afghan media finding stories which then...
Every day.
Every day.
I mean, I think it's hard to point to any one, but there's many of the stories that, became important for us at the New York Times, or I was previously at the Los Angeles Times, is that you'd see something on Tolo, hear a debate on one television, or you'd hear someone in your house would hear something on BBC Pashto or Dari, and you would say, well, that's interesting, let me try to track that down. And that could be, anything. One of the rape cases that became quite significant and where President Karzai played an enormously constructive role, that actually went after the Afghan local police, was something that was broken by Afghan media in Kunduz. And we heard about it in Kabul, and then later were able to flesh that out. So I think there are a number of kinds of stories that absolutely...
I have to ask, do you think that the international media was more attentive to the NATO ISAF kind of take or, on what was going on than anything else? Because that seems to be one of the most dominant stories, as it were. The whole...
Well, I think to some extent, they are certainly attentive to it. I don't necessarily think that added up always to the coverage, certainly that NATO ISAF wanted. They have an enormous media operation, so you can always reach somebody. You can't always reach the right person in an Afghan ministry to tell that story. Plus, you have pressure from home to say what your country is spending money on and spending lives on. So I think that to some extent that happened, but there was a lot of skepticism, I would say, among the media of certainly of the American military establishment after Iraq, where there were a lot was said that was pretty apparently not true. We're certainly seeing lately that that's the case, and I think people were quite skeptical.
Well, let me turn to Anatole. You have a regional perspective, and of course the attitude of the neighbors to the elections in Afghanistan is important. And I imagine you were covering the Pakistan elections last year. Do you have any thoughts on, prompted by a comparison by what's going on currently in Afghanistan and what's happening in Pakistan in terms of the significance of these elections?
You can see in Pakistan a consolidation of democracy to a degree. I think this always has to be qualified because the army remains obviously extremely powerful. And also, as long as what is in effect a civil war goes on in Pakistan, albeit a limited one, naturally the army is heavily, well, because the army is fighting the civil war, the army is heavily involved in internal politics. And of course, so are the intelligence services, including the ISI. I mean, the continuation of that war necessitates a role, other aspects of which are, of course, as I think we all know, extremely negative. But nonetheless, I think it is fair to say that despite certain serious tensions, and I've just come back last week from a trip to Pakistan, Owen Bennett-Jones of the BBC and I were taken to South Waziristan as well to see some of the campaign on the ground. And there are tensions. There are tensions over talks with the Pakistani Taliban. The military on the whole is very suspicious of these, fearing that it will lead to a giving up some of the gains that they've made. And of course there are also tensions over the trial of Musharraf, which the junior officers certainly are extremely unhappy about. But I think for all that, the speculation about any early threat of a military coup is greatly exaggerated. I can find no desire in the military for a coup at this stage, if only because, as some of them quite candidly say, of course, it would lead to taking responsibility for, a whole set of things that I think very few people would want to take responsibility for: electricity shortages, inflation, corruption, relations with India, all these things. So, the signs are so often in Pakistan are, on the one hand worrying, but on the other hand, at the moment at least, reasonably positive. As far as, but of course, in Pakistan, for all the upsets of the past, 70 years or so, the democratic process is obviously more consolidated than in Afghanistan, where, of course, these are only, it's been much less of a history. When it comes to, and so, there is perhaps more underlying confidence. The worrying thing in Pakistan is actually not, I think, at the moment, the sort of threat from the military. It's the rather depressing signs, in many ways, concerning economic reform in Pakistan. Because, we've now had a military government and a civilian government that have, failed to bring about radical change in Pakistan. Many of the signs of this new government, even though it is a government headed by businessmen, are also discouraging. And of course, if it isn't possible to turn that around, then there are obviously deep concerns about the future. When it comes to Pakistan's attitude to the Afghan elections, I think it's quite striking the degree to which there has been a genuinely hands-off approach. If only because sort of rational analysis in Pakistan suggests that there was no benefit to Pakistan to trying to interfere in this process in some way, or back forces trying to disrupt it, and very major downsides to that, in terms not just of international image, but even of Pakistan's own interests. So, we've heard that the Taliban was less successful in disrupting these elections than many of us had feared. I think it's also worth noting that, as far as we can see on this occasion at least, there were no moves from the Pakistani side to try to encourage the Haqqanis in particular to disrupt the elections, and that in itself is a very positive thing, because I think when it comes to Pakistani policy, something that's worth noting is that it is, of course, based on Pakistani ambitions and Pakistani fears. It's also based on an analysis going back to the 1980s or possibly even the 1970s, which essentially sees the basic struggle in Afghanistan as either a two-way or a three-way struggle between the army, which Pakistani analysis tends to see now as a Tajik army, the non-Pashtun nationalities, and a Pashtun ethnicity, which Pakistani analysis, and this here I'm not just talking about military analysis, but extending more widely in the Pakistani establishment, tends to see as dominated by and almost only truly represented by rural religious conservatives. In other words, Pakistani analysis tends to discount the whole world of, represented by figures like Ghani. And as I say, that's something that goes back to the 1980s when, Pakistan obviously saw Hekmatyar in particular as, basically the only person who counted on the anti-government camp. And now, I'm not saying that this is set in stone. I'm certainly not saying that the Pakistani military anymore is wedded to the idea of a Taliban victory in Afghanistan, because I don't think they are. I think that the threat to them from domestic Islamist insurgency, from their own Taliban, has very belatedly and, of course, only partially changed their calculations from that point of view, such that they still believe that the Taliban will have to be represented in government for there to be any settlement of the Afghan issue, but they are not actually backing the Taliban to complete victory, because they would see that as a very serious threat to themselves. So that, I think, has also contributed to this hands-off policy. But what I would say, I think, is that to change that into a belief that, if you like, the Taliban can be progressively marginalized, that's to say, really pushed, to the fringes of importance, of political and military importance in Pakistan, and that non-Taliban Pashtun forces, or, of course, non-Pashtun or perceived non-Pashtun leaders, but who genuinely representing also Pashtun constituencies, which clearly Abdullah would very much like to do. The only thing that will change Pakistani analysis on that is, if you like, facts.
Right.
It's if over the next few years, it becomes apparent that the political order in Afghanistan has stabilized itself, that it is supported by sufficient numbers of Pashtuns, that the Taliban is not making either military or political headway, then perhaps Pakistani analysis will change. But it will be changed, I think, by facts and not by arguments,
Well,
if you see what I mean.
Very interesting you referred to, Pakistani narratives on Afghanistan and how that influences, and I was reading a report commissioned by the US government a couple of years ago, which tries to understand Afghan narratives about themselves. And before turning to Thomas, I'm just tempted to share that with you. And this was done in 2011. And it said that there are 6 narratives, 2 of which all Afghans share, and 4 of which are disputed by Afghans. The 2 narratives that all Afghans share is that Afghanistan is a rich prize in a strategic part of the world and always going to be subject to dispute by great powers, and you just see this various iterations of this. And the second is that Afghanistan's future is always under assault by its neighbors, in particular by Pakistan. And these are 2 narratives to which many Afghans subscribe. But then there are 4 narratives which are more disputed. One is that Afghanistan has always relied for its independence upon vigorous freedom fighters, and the Taliban are now those vigorous freedom fighters. It used to be the Mujahideen, now it's the Taliban, and thank goodness they're there, because without them, the country would be overrun, will be forever overrun by foreigners. The second is that Afghanistan is essentially a Pashtun country, and it will really only find its identity when it resumes its Pashtun identity. The third is that Kabul has always been a hotbed of predatory, actors, often manipulated by foreigners. And the main responsibility of Afghans is to resist the predatory behavior of people in Kabul. And the fourth is that the history of Afghanistan can be explained in terms of a battle between reformers and conservative traditionalists, and it goes up and down, and that's the real battle on our hands right now. Thomas, what do you think in terms of these elections? As somebody has said, they have been interpreted as a setback for the Taliban, that they represented an act of defiance against the Taliban. Some would say they were an act of defiance against, or at least they were a vote against what many people think is the corruption represented by this regime. Do you think they were a setback for the Taliban? How do you think their narrative is dented or not by what's happened?
There are many narratives, and some of these narratives are also misleading, sometimes also misleading the Afghans who have internalized them so much, like that of the foreign hand, which is behind everything. I mean, it's not so that there's no foreign hand in Afghanistan, obviously, and hasn't been, but it very often is also very helpful then to forget what Afghans do or have contributed to the problems the country is facing. And that has a lot to do with the Taliban. I mean, there are also different narratives saying this is a Pakistani-led organization. It's a purely terrorist organization that has been created by the US. And then other people would say, to which I belong, that the Taliban are also a reaction to genuine social and economic problems in Afghanistan. But let's come to your question, the Taliban and elections and so on. Saad also has said that he sees the elections as a referendum against the Taliban. I see three factors, although I also have to say we need to be really careful because we do not yet have a complete picture of how these Afghan elections went. And I will just go to the figures which are often used. I mean, we don't know how many people live in Afghanistan. Nevertheless, we claim that 50% or 60% of them are young people, or let's say 50% are under voting age. We don't have a comprehensive voter registry. There are so many voter cards flying around in the country where we cannot be sure whether they're really linked to real individuals who then go and cast their votes. So we need to be very careful also with saying what is in those votes which are now counted. I think it has three elements. One, yes, it was a defiance against the Taliban, particularly those people in the cities who also use media and the social media, who have come out and have shown their fingers with the blue ink from the election. And many in the social media have also shown a finger to the Taliban with it. I mean, there were some middle fingers also shown from time to time. And I mean, the Taliban are also on Twitter, so they read that, and it shows that there is a lot of courage and so on. And that's one point. I also think that the unexpected turnout has to do that for the first time there was the chance to change the person at the head of the state in Afghanistan. I mean, Karzai has been seen as the favorite of the Americans, and most of the Afghans thought that their president is anyway determined in Washington, whether that's true or not. In the beginning, it probably was more true than later. But now, with the constitution, it was possible to change. And yes, many people went to certain candidates because they thought these are people who know something about economy, who have a modern mindset and so on. They wanted to vote for them. And the third one, again, also has to do with the Taliban, again, that they actually, with their threats and also the violent actions before elections, have created a backlash. I mean, that people have said, no, we do not accept this kind of violence, and particularly the killing of what Saad also has mentioned, of the Afghan journalist Sadr Ahmad and his family in a very cruel way has contributed to that. And also how the Taliban have reacted to that. First they claimed it, then they said, no, it was not us, and probably it was just stray fire and so on. It might have been Afghan soldiers who killed them and so on. That's very difficult to find out. The Taliban themselves, when you look at how they have reacted on their website and their official statements, they were definitely angry about what happened on the election day. It has to do with the discussion of were there incidents, were there no incidents. In the beginning, there was a very low number reported of incidents. Ministry of Interior in Afghanistan said, I think on the election day, 130-something. After 2-3 days, they were at 600. Yes, there was a media blackout. Also, Afghan journalists sometimes encouraged, apparently, by government people. I'm not sure whether by the central government, but we have reports from a couple of provinces where the governors or other influential people have actually urged them not to report. And there was not a lot reporting, although it has been broken, as Saad has said earlier. But it emerges that there were many more security incidents than were reported and that many people wanted to hear about, which have also prevented a lot of people from voting in those areas which were more insecure. And when you start poking in those areas where there's not a lot of media coverage and where there are not many observers, irregularities start popping up, like in Wardak, where there were some journalists and found out. We had people in Paktia and so on. And this includes something which also is a figure which is very prominently reflected in the media internationally, that there's a turnout of, I think, 34 or 36% of women. I mean, it's very clear that in many of the Pashtun areas there was bulk voting, that the village elders went with a bag full of these voter cards which are flying out and said, that's the vote of our women. And that also makes then polling stations where you have 300 women voting, and no one has ever seen anything like this in south of Kabul, and probably also north of Kabul. It's quite difficult still. The Taliban were angry about, they have been on Twitter on the election day also and have just shot off a barrage of saying, oh, we have disrupted here and there and that, and why do these satanic Afghan media not report about that? So it was something which they did not like. And they have turned or have started a narrative on their media which was much sharper than during elections in earlier years, saying that this whole exercise is completely un-Islamic and it's a Western conspiracy and so on, and said that they are generally against elections. But there was also a debate apparently amongst the Taliban, because some of these articles which appeared on websites which are officially attributed to the Taliban have been taken down a day or two later. But still some very sharp articles are there. So it seems to be that not all Taliban agree that elections are completely out of question. And even it might also be a rhetoric figure in a way. So they are angry now. It might be that during a second round of voting, which is necessary now, they take revenge and go out and start killing people. Although I think even that danger is a little bit overestimated, because, I mean, we can say a lot of bad things about the Taliban. That's really necessary. They use terrorist means, etc., PP, but they're not only a terrorist organization. They still have some kind of a constituency in Afghanistan. I mean, they would probably not win open elections, or very certainly not, but there are some people who are also so alienated from the current political setup that they probably would say, just to be defiant, that yes, we go for the Taliban. And the Taliban have never done kind of or pulled off actions like what the jihadis in Iraq do, just walk into a marketplace, blow themselves up and kill 150 civilians. They usually go after targets which they see as legitimate, which very often are civilian, which under international humanitarian law are not legitimate targets, and then kill scores of Afghans who are standing around and in kind of bad luck or something like that, which is also, of course, not a very attractive position to Afghans. So I also don't see now that they will hit at the second round, because that is now built up as an argument that probably let's have a deal before the second round so that we can avoid violence during the second round of voting. I think Afghans now should go through this democratic exercise, and that is the third part, which I forgot to mention, of the message which probably came out by the high turnout, is Afghans can do democracy. Muslims can do democracy. I mean, I've heard many people, diplomats, people in the UN saying in Afghanistan from the beginning, oh, Afghans are not ripe for democracy. Many Afghans also say we need to be educated first, then we can have elections. That's completely wrong. We have seen that in early elections for the Loya Jirgas, 2002, 2003. We have seen that before the first election in 2004 and parliamentary 2005, and we've seen that now again. And we should really give them the opportunity to go through this process. And not falling back into old patterns of how positions and power are distributed in Afghanistan. Because now, I mean, the way the campaign went, you had all these kind of endorsements by local leaders, former warlords, commanders, political parties, mujahideen groups, and so on, who all are queuing up now behind the two main contenders. And they represent that old corrupt system very often, and also the part of the violence which has infiltrated that system also. I mean, it's not black and white, Taliban bad, rest of them good. And it is important that I think whoever will be the next president goes back and makes these votes of the young people in the urban areas, about which we can halfway be sure that there were many, count in a sense that not only it's counted for the victory, but that this hope for change and for reform is
even once they are in power as well.
Yeah, but also to change the way Afghanistan is ruled and governed. Until now, it has been ruled. Karzai has very often been called the mayor of Kabul, which I think is completely wrong. He has a grip over the administrative system countrywide, but governance was bad. I mean, life of people have not been improved. There was not really service delivery. This needs to change, and the candidates can only do that if they capitalize on that vote and on the young and educated people who are there in the urban areas, but also in rural areas. Because it also doesn't mean if in many rural areas probably people have not voted, if we find that out. It doesn't mean that these people are pro-Taliban. It just says that our assessment probably was a bit optimistic, and that the security situation in the countryside is still much worse than we want to believe. And that brings me to one point, which is another thing on the major topic which should be on the agenda when a new president comes in, which is taking the Taliban seriously as a fact in Afghanistan. It doesn't help to call them terrorists and instruments of Pakistan and externalize that problem or blame someone else. It's a reflection of the corrupt system. I mean, the Taliban now are very ideologicized, but in the beginning were much more heterogeneous than they are now, because it was a reaction to exclusion of certain tribal groups by corrupt system and predatory behavior, mainly in the provinces, not so much in Kabul. And that needs to be tackled. And for that, we also need the media. And the moment we have, I think, public opinion and publicized opinion in Afghanistan has turned against negotiations with the Taliban, which was much more, let's call it popular, 2007, 2008, 2009, where I heard a lot of Afghans saying that, yes, we need to sit down with the Taliban. When you ask them about what you want to talk, they would say, it doesn't matter, let's sit down first, we will find our way. And the moment it said, no, let's not talk with them, that legitimizes them, that puts them on equal footing with everyone else, because they're killing all these people. The thing is, in the government in Afghanistan, there are also a lot of people who've killed a lot of people, they do not recognize that. That also needs to be addressed to get out of the doldrums in Afghanistan and actually solve the main problem is ending the war, at least decreasing violence.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. And I'd like to take a bunch of questions, and ending the war is an extremely good point. It's something that hasn't really featured. There is a conflict going on, 400 police being killed a month, or is it ANSF, many hundreds of ANSF and police being killed a month, something that's often forgotten. Could you, and more civilians than ever. I will take a crop of questions. We started a little bit late, so we're going to end a little bit late. Do I have any volunteers? Please do. Yes, I'm delighted that Edward Girardet is here. He is the author of the Essential Field Guide to Afghanistan, which we will talk about at the drinks after this. Edward.
Thank you. Quick question for perhaps Saad or Lissa. Can you comment perhaps on the media that you see to be supported by various warlords or business factions perhaps, which you consider to be perhaps threatening to free media, free reporting, or the reporting that's needed? perhaps Mazar-e Sharif or other places.
Okay, can I take a couple more questions? Yes, sir. Please identify yourself, if you would. Here in the front row.
Anis Qadri, I'm a member of Chatham House. My question is for Thomas. How much would this be a factor for Abdullah, the fact that he's only half Pashtun, if it goes into the runoff elections? How much would that be a factor?
Okay, could I take another question? There was a hand somewhere else. I didn't catch it. Yes, Elizabeth Winter in the blue cardigan.
Thanks. Yes, it's another question about the media. We did a study at LSE, which we'll be launching shortly, which shows that there's very little discussion in the media about development issues, something like 4%, and the vast majority of media coverage internationally seems to be negative. It was certainly borne out in the English press. Is there anything we should be doing about it?
Right. In some ways, that's a question about whether the Afghan media challenge the candidates on their own views as to how to, address some of the country's own economic problems. Right. 3 questions there. Warlords threatening a free media, and if I can add a rider to that and turn to you first, Saad, is how sustainable is the free media? Is the media in Afghanistan? I mean, what does it depend upon? Presumably advertising revenues, but also quite a lot of the media, Afghan media, is dependent upon international donors. And I mean, are we going through a sort of bubble? Can it survive? And if these resources to keep it going are going to diminish, does that make it more vulnerable to warlords and people who are in a position to support the media?
Well, I think there's no doubt that we're going to see consolidation in the media sector. The warlords do have their own TV stations, the warlords, the religious leaders. But ironically, they're not doing particularly well. And the warlords themselves are not doing particularly well. If you look at the election results, this wasn't just a rejection of the Taliban, it was also a rejection of people like Sayyaf, Qutbuddin Hilal, and many others who assumed that they would do quite well, and Sayyaf only got 5% of the vote, or 7%. And Qutbuddin Hilal, who was a very senior Hizb Islami leader, got 2.7%. And their channels tend to be very boring. They tend to just promote one individual. So their viewership is not that significant. Initially, we were quite concerned about them, but since then we've realized it's going to be difficult for them to carry on. There will be a consolidation. Obviously, a lot of media receives assistance from USAID and others, and we have also been beneficiaries. But the Afghan ad market it's a $100 million ad market, probably the size of Jordan's ad market, although the population is much smaller. It is growing. Companies are becoming more sophisticated. If it stays if it stays flat and just goes sideways in the next couple of years, it will still allow for probably 10 media outlets to prosper. But the other 50 or 60 will probably either go belly up or they will have to sell.
So you're not too worried about the sustainability of the...
No, we're very worried about the economic transition I talked about before, in terms of what, given that the Afghan economy has been so reliant on the donor community, what do we need to do in order for Afghanistan to maintain its GDP, which is relatively low. But we're not panicked just yet.
And in answer to Elizabeth's question, I mean, why hasn't, or is it correct that there's been very little discussion about kind of development and economic issues around these elections? And if so,
in Afghanistan,
why not?
there have been obviously a lot of discussions about job creation. Well, I think unfortunately the international media was very positive in Afghanistan in the early years. Now it's very negative. I mean, I was in Washington and someone said, well, Mr. Mohseni, your elections were very ethnic. I said, exactly like yours. How many white people voted for Obama and how many Hispanics and African Americans voted for Mitt Romney? And they said, well, it's rural versus urban. That's the same as your country. And what's ironic was, in some of the criticisms I have of the New York Times, they find this village that no one votes. Well, we can find hundreds of districts in the U.S. where it's predominantly African American or Hispanic that people don't bother showing up and voting. So, but the media, the Western media, has been very negative on Afghanistan, and in particular the New York Times and probably some of the British media. which probably needs more balance.
Anatole.
Yes, forgive me, but I have to point out one difference. America is not dependent for 90% of its budget on Afghanistan. Afghanistan is dependent for 90% of its budget on international donors. And that is a crucially important aspect of these elections we haven't mentioned yet. I'm not taking sides for or against the New York Times, God forbid, but one of the reasons why it is so important that these elections be seen as, legitimate, possibly flawed, but basically free and fair, is that I'm sorry to say, but there are people in the US Congress and, of course, in European parliaments who would very much like steeply to reduce aid to Afghanistan in the years to come. And I feel that it is very important to remind people, and I always do whenever I have the chance to capture an audience, that, I was a journalist. I actually managed to go to both sides in the 1980s finally. And, of course, the Najibullah regime survived very much better than most of us expected, including, I have to say, myself. It collapsed in 1992 when the subsidies were collapsed because of the Soviet collapse. And, that aspect, well, obviously, given a 90% dependence, 100% dependence, more or less, when it comes to funding the security services on US aid, the importance of continuing that aid simply cannot be exaggerated.
Well, some would dispute that. There was a question about the significance of, Abdullah being half Pashto.
Yeah, that's about whether voting in Afghanistan goes along ethnic lines. But let me just say very quickly something about the media also. There's not only the threat by the warlords, there's also a threat by the government, which is, according to the Afghanistan Journalist Center, more than half of violent attacks on Afghan journalists last year came from government officials. That's when they start reporting about touchy things and naming names. That's a taboo. There are large taboo zones in the Afghan media. I read them, English, Pashto, Dari, and so on. There's another concern. Funding already has shrunken, and some good media are not as well financed, like Pajwak News Agency. They had to lay off a lot of journalists already, 4 or 5 years ago, and other larger, good quality Afghan media also. And there is a constant onslaught over these or across these soft issues like what's Islamic and cultural and so on. About soap operas which they buy from India, and then some of the ulama stand up and say, oh, we cannot show that because that's un-Islamic, and it shows that there are women running around without a headscarf and so on. And then TV stations come under pressure not to broadcast them. I think you also experienced that in Tulu. And this is a preparation for harder issues, because if they have the upper hand in this discourse, those people to define what is Islamic, what is un-Islamic, that also comes into the sphere where it becomes politically interesting. So now journalists who start reporting about corruption, for instance, say, oh, you are attacking our jihadi leaders, you are un-Islamic because you attack those people who are our Islamic leaders. And no one dares to contradict that anymore. No one is relative. But on the ethnicization, we have seen during this election, as far as we can see, that from these patterns that Pashtuns vote for Pashtuns and Tajiks vote for Tajiks, there is a movement away from that. We cannot say how far and how sustainable that will be. But people in Afghanistan start understanding, and they know that since a long time, that it is not only about ethnicity, it's about that they need good people who are able to govern their country. And we have looked at Hazaras, who have mainly voted for Abdullah, also for their Hazara leaders, but not for the ones from the area they come from, interestingly. And apparently also the Uzbeks have not voted for Dostum, which is also a sign of hope.
Fascinating. Let me just take a few more, because we really are running out of time. The lady at the back, the gentleman at the back, and the gentleman here with the glasses. Can we take those three? Lady at the back, you put her hand up. Do you want to identify yourself? if it's very brief, because we're really running out of time, please go ahead, madam.
I'm from Afghanistan, and I just want to say that the way that the Afghans can do democracy, it's I can tell the Afghans have their own way of the elections they call Grand Assembly. And like nearly 4 centuries ago, the first Afghan king, Ahmad Shah Durrani, was actually elected by the tribal leaders, by the elders, and that was purely a democratic process. So yes, Afghans can do
Thank you very much,
democracy.
Sir. At the back.
Deodat Maharaj, member of Chatham House. Just quickly, we talk about the state in Afghanistan being very centralized. I mean, government is legitimate to some extent in Kabul. Can you just make a commentary in terms of the role of the media? Is the media involved and engaged? And when we look at the evolving landscape, to what extent will the Afghan media have influence and outreach in areas out of Kabul? Secondly, there's been a lot of commentary on the security forces within Afghanistan, particularly with the upcoming full withdrawal of international forces. I mean, do you have any comments or views on the resilience of the Afghan national forces in the context of the elections and how they did? And the last question...
That's 3 questions.
And the last question, really, any thoughts in terms of what will happen in the runoff and the alliances that will form?
Okay. May I have to choose one of those? Yes, please, sir.
James Dean from BBC Media Action. A little while ago, we produced a report also on the media of Afghanistan, written by my colleagues here, Shirazuddin Siddiqui and David Page. Michael, this is for you, actually. In that report, one of the things that we were most puzzled by was, yes, we talked about warlords, we talked about advertising revenue, we talked about the development of the different trends going on. But the thing we were most puzzled by was the lack of a strategy for media support within the context of a transition. We couldn't find any space or place where donors or development actors were actually gathering together to talk about how do we ensure that the legacy of the relatively free and plural media that Saad's talked about so powerfully can be secured post-transition. And do you have a point, does anyone have a point, but perhaps particularly Michael, about why that is and perhaps what can be done about it?
Okay, another question. There was one more here. Anthony Fitzherbert.
This is maybe for the whole panel, Anthony Fitzherbert. I'm finding it very difficult to get a handle on who has actually been voting, because knowing that the writ of government and governance doesn't stretch very far outside many of the provincial capitals, to what extent has the vote reflected a rural vote, or is it mainly an urban vote?
Right. We're going to have to answer these very, very succinctly indeed. In terms of who's voted, I think that's a difficult one, because unless, Saad, do you have...
I just want to make one observation, which a lot of people don't comment on, and we have to do these studies in order to figure out our programming. The rural-urban divide is not 30-70 anymore. It's getting very close to 50-50. If you look at towns like Pulakhumri, which was a very small town when I was growing up, 40,000 people, it's now 400,000 people. Kabul today extends to Charikar, which is technically the capital city of Parwan province. People live in Charikar, they commute to Kabul. So, you know, this new urbanized Afghanistan, which is predominantly young, you know, the stats that we're seeing, we're looking at the median age of 18, second youngest country after Uganda. It's transforming the country. Now, not that the rural Afghanistan should be ignored, but the one interesting thing about media is that its reach is now, you know, 70% of 65-70% of Afghans now watch television. And for the first time, the primary source of information and news for most Afghans is now television rather than radio after 13 years. So media is playing a very important role. Does it engage everyone in rural Afghanistan? Probably not, because of logistical and weather reasons. But a lot of local communities, they self-regulate. Even if they're cut off from the center, they tend to find ways to self-regulate. So it's not completely, as Thomas pointed out, we're not talking about Kabul and the rest of Afghanistan. There is a connection because of the media and because of some governance today, and also because of this urbanized Afghanistan. A lot of urban dwellers tend to go back and visit rural communities. Afghanistan is more united than it's ever been, probably even since the 70s and 60s.
Thank you. Let me try and answer the question and probably be, and I feel, Saad, you should answer it, or others, but why has there not been a media strategy, so international strategy for media support in Afghanistan? I mean, I agree it is a big problem, but I would say, number one, this is not something that the Afghans have made a priority in terms of their engagement with the international community, and there's a broader issue there, which I think is about what Afghans do want as their own priorities, but it hasn't been one of them. Secondly, there are so many other competing priorities. Those are probably two inadequate answers, but I agree it is a real concern that the Afghan media may be much more vulnerable in the future. I don't think the political case has been made as to why the Afghan media is so important, and it is incredibly important. You've made it in your reports, but it's not something that is well understood. I suspect it's also seen as very politically controversial for donors to be supporting the Afghan media, and there's a long story there. But do you want to answer any of the? The New York Times has been accused of all sorts of dastardly things, and you haven't you haven't responded since you left, of course. Right. And there's also the question about security forces. I don't think we can go into that. The one thing I would say is how extraordinarily supportive and proud of the security forces the Afghans, and including the Afghan media, has been, I think, over the last year. But Alyssa, and then Anatole, and then we may have to cut it. Yeah.
I think your points were well taken, that it's not something, I think Afghans are still not sure how to engage with the media. They know they like it. They know that it's brought the modern world. I mean, probably Tolo has been one of the great modernizing forces in Afghanistan because of things like the soap operas and seeing what other people do and beginning to therefore consider different ways to live. And in the same way, urbanization has been. But I don't think that people don't know what to believe in Afghanistan. That remains a huge problem, and whether you're Western or Afghan media, you confront that every day. And so I think the idea of supporting something when you're not yet sure you can trust it, and when you suspect that people are tools of someone, but you're not sure who, it always is going to slide down for a while until credibility is built up.
Right. Anatole.
I'll just try briefly to say something about the security force.
Please do, yeah, the question. There.
I mean, once again, sorry to repeat myself, but clearly continued Western aid and financing is essential. I mean, if the soldiers are not paid, then they will not merely go home, they will go home with their weapons, and they will join a whole range of local militias, including the Taliban. Something that worries NATO commanders in Afghanistan greatly is the impending lack of air cover. Because after all, even if as we must assume, given the position of the candidates, the BSA is signed, as presently understood in Washington, this will not provide combat air cover beyond the end of this year. The very earliest that it is predicted that the Afghan National Army can generate its own air cover is 2017. That's a very worrying position if you are in an outlying ANA position, somewhere in the south and east. That said, I think that there is an understanding among some people in the Taliban, some people, and I really would not like to say how many or what proportion, that while they can probably make fairly extensive gains in part of the countryside in the south and east, largely, it seems to me, or quite likely, not by military offensives, but by local deals of the kind that I saw very extensively on the ground in the later 1980s. Some of them do seem to understand that that is a very different matter from storming defended cities in the face of superior firepower on the other side. And perhaps, the best chance of a peace settlement at some stage will be if the Taliban can be convinced that in the end they can fight for a generation, and yet they will never be able actually to win an outright victory militarily. But once again, I fear that by far the greater part of the Taliban will have to be convinced of that by actually failing militarily on the ground.
We are now coming to an end. Thomas, do you have a final word?
Yes, very briefly on who voted. I mean, as said, in the rural areas we do not have a complete picture yet, but we looked into one important district in Paktia and Zurmat, where last time there were, I think, 9 votes by the policemen who were guarding the polling station. This time, at least a few hundred or even a few thousand people voted in some of the polling stations. But if you see Gardez, one not unimportant provincial center in the city, a lot of turnout at the edges where there was a big school where I was last time and this time a colleague. Yes, but only men, no women. And a few kilometers further on, still in the capital district, no voters at all. I mean, that might not be representative, but I guess it is more representative than we want to have it. Yeah, but it does not mean that the people don't want to vote, but I think that still the threats of the Taliban had their impact, and that needs to be calculated in.
Within Panjwai, for example, in Kandahar, when no one voted in 2009 and there was no security in the entire province, people were queued up outside polling stations. It was an extraordinary sight because we had live broadcasts from Panjwai in dozens of other districts. So this high voter turnout was a national phenomenon. It wasn't confined to the cities.
Well, I think we have to bring this to conclusion. Let me thank the speakers very much for a terrific contribution and the questions from the floor. Alyssa, you said people, don't really know what to believe in Afghanistan. And I have to say one of the reasons that those of you who want to know more about reality in Afghanistan should buy the Essential Field Guide to Afghanistan, and I declare myself as one of the contributors, but there are several people in the room who've also contributed. The wonderful thing about these elections, in some ways, it's about Afghans saying they believe in themselves. They believe in their own ability to shape their own future. And I think it can be argued that, as Thomas sort of touched upon, perhaps Afghans could be more assertive about shaping their own destiny. But I think it is certainly the case that the international community has not often or given enough space, political space, to Afghans to sort out their own problems, whether it's in the field of reconciliation, whether it's in the field of identifying their own development needs, whether it's in other fields. I think one very powerful thing about these elections, and as has been said, is elections are now a central part of the Afghan political landscape. They are there. That should not be confused with Afghans being the only basis upon which political power is transferred in Afghanistan. It is an important part of the way in which power is shared, power is transferred. And the reason that it's changing, in part, is thanks to the role that the Afghan media has played, in particular the role that Saad and your colleagues, not only in your group, but other parts of the Afghan media have played. And this is fundamentally important at a time when international interest in Afghanistan is going to plummet. I suspect that international media presence is already dropping really fast. International coverage is going to stop. I think the Americans feel that they've done their best, job done, they're out. I suspect an awful lot of other countries are out too. So the role of the Afghan media, Pache, our colleagues in the Afghan Media Trust, is incredibly important. So I hope that in a year's time we'll be able to meet again and continue to talk about the essential role that the Afghan media is playing in shaping Afghanistan's political landscape. Let me end by saying I hope you will come upstairs and have a drink up in the room upstairs. And on that note, let me thank the participants. Thank you.